All right, let's take a look at this first phase shift problem from the practice rather. So for starters, we're going to label A, B, C, and D. A is the number that's in front of sine, which is just a 1. B is the number directly in front of x. C is pi, and D is -3. And it's helpful to label those because that kind of helps you utilize these little formulas if you need them. So your amplitude is just A, so our amplitude is 1. Period, you're going to take 2 pi and divide it by the b value, or in other words, the number that's in front of x. So the period of this graph is just going to be pi. What I like to do when you figure out the period is go ahead and you can label the 4th tick mark on your graph pi. And I'm going to go back and put -pi on the left. The vertical displacement, that's how far up or down you move your graph, and that's the d value. Since it's -3, that means we need to shift everything down 3. To show that on the graph, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw in a new midline down at -3. So we're going to kind of imagine this like our new x-axis. And then last but not least, if there's a reflection, there's not a negative in front of the sign, nor is there a negative in front of x, so there's no reflection here. Once you get those 4 set, I would recommend go ahead and graph it now. So now we need to worry about whether it's sine or cosine. It's the graph of sine, so you're going to start by graphing the wave. You have a point at the origin, a point at the period, a point in the middle, then it's going to go up and down from that. Since there's no reflection, it's going to go up first and then down. So let's go ahead and graph this first cycle. So it's going to start at what is essentially our new origin. It's going to go up from here. Amplitude is just 1. It's going to go to the middle, down 1, and then the middle again. So this is the first cycle of that graph. I'm going to double check. We have the amplitude of 1, the period, the graph stops at pi, or at least the first cycle stops at pi. We shifted it down 3, and there were no reflections. All right, now we're going to move into the phase shift aspect of this. So this is where you're going to take your C value and divide it by B. So the phase shift is pi over 2, and since it's minus in between that, it means we need to shift everything pi over 2 to the right. So to do this, it's helpful to figure out where pi over 2 is on your x-axis. So if the 4th tick mark is pi, that means the 2nd tick mark would be pi over 2. That's going to be our new starting point. So I like to draw in a new starting point for that as well. So I think that makes it a little bit easier. Or you can just count and move every point over to the right too. Basically, I'm going to recreate that first cycle of the graph now from that new midpoint. And that's where our graph's going to end up. So I'm going to highlight that, showing that that's our first cycle. I'm going to go ahead and fill in a few more cycles of this graph. Like this. We can now figure out our domain and range. Domain is going to be all real numbers, and range is going to go from -4 to -2. And I'm going to go ahead and show you how to graph this in your calculator. So to graph this in your calculator, you want to make sure that you're in radian mode. So hit the mode button, radian is highlighted, so we're good there. Then I'm going to go to y equals and type in my equation. It's sine of 2x minus pi, close the parenthesis, and then -3. And the most important thing when you graph these is, 1, you want to be in radian mode. Okay, so 1, you want to be in radians. And 2, you want to make sure that your window is set to match what's happening on your graph. So for the window, we want to make sure that the x minimum, I like to do whatever the period is but negative, so -pi. For the x maximum, I'm just going to make this go up to what the period is, so pi, and for the x scale, take the period and divide that by 4. So in this case, it'd be pi over 4 for your scale. So if I go to Window, I want to make it go from negative pi to positive pi, and I'm going to make the scale be pi over 4. And I'm going to make the x and y min and max match up with the graph that's on your paper. So I'm going to make it go from negative 6 to 6. And hit graph. So what you can, if you set the tick marks to match what's on your paper, it's a lot easier to check, so you can see it's on the y-axis. It starts down at negative 3, which our graph does. At the first tick mark, our graph's at its lowest point. So let's look at our picture. At our first tick mark, our graph's at our lowest point. At the second tick mark, it looks like it's in the middle again, which it is. The third tick mark, it's at its highest point. And at the fourth tick mark, it's back at the middle. Alright, so that's good enough to check. You could use the table if you like, but I think just looking at the graph and making sure the scale is set properly, that should be good enough.